So we ended up with a farm about 45 miles from Washington, D.C. This was in the early 1960s, and you know, obviously D.C. was a different town then, none of the suburbs, you know, a small southern sleepy town. And this farm was quite something. It had a mile-long, very rutted driveway. No one had lived in the house for decades. And my dad didn't believe in creature comforts. So he never bothered to put in central heat and never bothered to put the plumbing in either. And I learned a lot about the hard work of farming, things like squishing potato bugs and chopping kindling and plucking chickens. And you can imagine that when I was 18, I couldn't wait to get away from that farm. But I learned a lot of lessons there, and I'm an only child, and I was really lucky. I inherited that family farm that my husband does run today. And so, you know, it's a metropolitan area now with a lot of people who want local food, and there's a market for direct sales. So we're some of the lucky ones. Most farmers aren't so lucky to live next to a large metropolitan area. Well, I want to talk a little bit tonight about farm policy and how we actually ended up with this dysfunctional system that we have today. And I want to make the case that we should vote with our forks, then we should vote with our votes, then we should hold people accountable, and that it's going to take real political action too to get out of this mess that we're in. But I'm going to start back before World War II, because that's really when modern farm policy begins. Are these seats taken over here? Please come on over, some of you folks. There are seats. So you'll remember that in the 1920s, we were in an economic crisis, and a lot of the same actors caused that crisis as the ones who caused our recent financial crash. I'm talking about speculators and companies on Wall Street. So it was not just working people and urban people who were hurt. Our farms were really devastated, and in the first few years of the 1930s, we lost 1/6 of all our family farms, and we're still left with about 6.8 million farms. Now, when the Roosevelt administration came into office, they wanted to begin to not just fix things for urban workers, but to help save family farming. So they instituted a number of policies that worked pretty well. In fact, we could think about reinstituting some of them today. They took millions of acres of marginal land out of production. They created a grain reserve. You know, China's had a grain reserve since 1854. It stabilizes grain prices, prevents famines. They had programs that helped ensure that farmers could make the cost of production, and a lot of other things that really made it viable for people to make a living on the farm, and also possible for consumers to have fair food prices. So what happened? Well, after World War II, you know, the United States had dramatically changed. It had become an industrial powerhouse, and the center of finance had moved from London to New York. And there were a number of business leaders who thought that farming, agriculture, that was the old way. We didn't need so many farmers. Really, we could have much larger farms, and that we needed all those young farm boys who would be going into farming and who would take over their family farm. They needed to go to the industrial north to be farm labor. They needed to be the workforce for the new country. And they were actually interested in cheap labor. So a number of these business leaders got together and formed kind of an early lobbying organization called the Committee for Economic Development. It was started by people like the president of Studebaker, a very large car company of the time, executive from Kodak Eastman, and they recruited most of the titans of industry over the next 20 years to this organization that was really focused on changing public policy in the U.S. in a number of areas, but in agriculture was one of their targets. And it was because they hoped to have a workforce for factories. So they didn't make a whole lot of progress until the 1950s under the Eisenhower administration. When President Eisenhower came into office, he appointed one of his secretaries of agriculture was Ezra Benson. And Ezra Benson was an ideologue. And he really didn't like the New Deal farm programs. In fact, when you read about him, I don't think he cared for farmers a whole lot. And he believed that vertical integration was the future, larger farms, and really wanted to change the New Deal farm programs that he thought were actually leading the country into communism. Remember, this was the McCarthy era and kind of the red baiting period. So he did use his position to begin chipping away at some of those programs. And by the 1960s, the Committee for Economic Development had become a very influential organization that was kind of leading the charge towards what I think we would call today depopulating rural areas and moving people more into urban areas to be workers. In fact, in the 1930s, 54% of the population lived on farms. Today, 16% of people actually live in rural areas of the country. So it's changed dramatically. Now, I'm not saying that this is some kind of wild conspiracy. This is just individuals from a certain perspective, industrialists, well, you know, getting together and strategizing over time and trying to move public policy the direction that they thought would benefit their businesses and, you know, probably the country as well. I doubt if they could envision what the policies they were advocating for would actually lead. So in 1962, the Committee for Economic Development wrote a very influential report called an Adaptive Plan for Agriculture. And it laid out all of the reasons that the New Deal farm programs should be completely eliminated. It talked about the future of food production being a globalized supply, with the U.S. being a leader in grain production, and food production really moving to where labor was cheaper. And it talked about getting new education programs for young men, because of course they didn't envision in the 1960s that young women might want to go into farming too. So it was all about how to move young men in rural areas out of agriculture. And by this time they were a quite well-known group, and the two co-chairs of the Committee for Economic Development were the CEO of Sears and the CEO of Ford. And they wrote this report with the economics departments of our most prestigious universities in the country. And they had also attracted to the CED a lot of the important institutions in our society, publishing houses, other institutions that provide education, and television stations. And this report was really widely circulated. And the farm organizations were quite upset. In fact, they had catalog marches where they drove their Ford pickup trucks around state houses and around local county courthouses, and took their Sears catalogs. Of course, everybody had Sears catalogs in those days, and burned them. You know, those organizations were pretty influential at that time. but they were not able to completely hold back this tide of encouraging the consolidation in agriculture. Now, going into the 1970s, in our kind of quick survey of farm policy, one of Ezra Benson's proteges was actually Richard Nixon's Secretary of Agriculture. And I know that a lot of you are old enough to remember him, because I remember him. His name was Earl Butz. And you younger people will see that everybody who's older is kind of chuckling, because he was a piece of work. In fact, he eventually got fired under the Ford administration for making racial slurs. The year before, he had been to a major food conference in Rome and made lewd jokes about the Pope, and finally he ended up getting fired. But he was very egotistical. He too was not real fond of family farmers, and he went around the country and on television lecturing farmers to get big or get out, to invest a lot of money in equipment, in land, because the U.S. was going to become a grain powerhouse. And if you didn't invest a lot of money, you weren't going to become a rich farmer. Well, unfortunately for farmers, there was only 1 year in the 1970s that farmers actually had an overseas market for grain. And that was the year that Richard Nixon ran for president against George McGovern, my first election that I voted in. He was concerned, Earl Butz and those players around Nixon, they were concerned that rural people were going to vote Democratic, because of course in the South at that time did still vote democratically. So Earl Butz decided to put together a grain deal with the Soviet Union. It was slightly shady because the Soviet Union had had a huge crop loss that year. So he got together with the grain traders, companies like Cargill and ConAgra, and put together this grain deal, a several $billion grain deal that did make some farmers money. Of course, the cost of bread the next year went up, but by that time Richard Nixon was already elected. And lots of farmers went out of business. I mean, it's a really sad story, and it's really the beginning of the modern part of our continuing agricultural crisis. Because what happens when farmers borrow a lot of money? They usually put their farms up as collateral. And putting in crops is expensive. And if you don't get back the cost of production, and if you're not able to pay your banknote, eventually, you know, for some farmers the first year, maybe for some other farmers second or third year, you end up losing your farm. And during that period, we did lose millions of farms. So going into the 1980s, agriculture was in really bad shape. But there had been a number of societal changes that you'll remember if you lived through that period or from your history books. From the 1960s on, of course, there was a lot of pressure to have regulation for companies. And in fact, a lot of our major environmental laws passed in the early 1970s. And there was a whole social and cultural change going on. Ralph Nader advocating for consumers. And a lot of business leaders were really upset by this. And one of the things that Richard Nixon did was appoint a man named Lewis Powell to be a Supreme Court Justice. And Lewis Powell had been a corporate lawyer. I think he was on about 11 corporate boards around the time that he got made a Supreme Court Justice. And 2 months before Richard Nixon actually nominated him, he wrote a very famous memo. In fact, it wasn't public at the time, but you can do a Google search today and find the Powell memo and actually read it. And what he basically told his friend at the Chamber of Commerce was that there was a social and cultural revolution going on, and that it was going to hurt business, and that business leaders needed to get busy trying to organize to turn back this social, cultural, and regulatory revolution, and that they needed to raise money, they needed to start forming their own organizations, they needed to do what essentially is movement building, they needed to influence universities. It was a very succinct, strategic memo about how to turn back the winds of the 1960s and 1970s. Now, I mention this because that has had a dramatic effect on our political system and therefore our food system. And in fact, a number of business leaders did take this very seriously and begin organizing public interest groups like Cato, Heritage Foundation. They began recruiting millionaires at the time, billionaires today, to put money into elections and to basically change the way public policy was made in this country. And one of the things that they did was join together to vet and to raise money for a presidential candidate in 1980. I think it was 1981, Ronald Reagan was elected, and that was money put together by the oil industry, the grocery industry, a number of big industries. And one of the promises that he made to his benefactors was to get rid of antitrust law, because these very large food companies, but a lot of other industries, I named the oil companies among the most influential, they wanted to get bigger. They were arguing that it was to compete with Japan at the time, but it was really about becoming multinational and becoming much larger and wealthier and influential companies. And so what they did, when Ronald Reagan came into office, he appointed some ideologues to the two main agencies that oversee antitrust law, and that's the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission. Now, I had the pleasure in writing Foodopoly to actually interview Michael Perchuk, who had been a Carter-appointed commissioner to the Federal Trade Commission. And he told me the really sad story about what happened to his agency, about how from the 1940s onward, antitrust law had worked really well. In fact, both parties had agreed that antitrust law was important, and not just around monopolies' control on pricing, but about political power. And of course, when you look back in the history of the United States, this has long been a debate. And one of the reasons that at certain periods in time we have had strong antitrust laws and enforcement. So this has been agreed upon by both parties, but when James Miller came to the Federal Trade Commission, he cut the staff, he cut the whole departments, stopped all the investigations like the one of the grocery industry that was going on, and I think most importantly, narrowed the definition of what an antitrust violation actually is. And so since that time, we basically haven't had vigorous antitrust enforcement, most of the time any antitrust enforcement. And one of the things that we would need to do is to actually strengthen the language around antitrust issues, and then to actually enforce the law. Even enforcing the weak law would be a good beginning. So what happens when companies do get to be really large? They have a lot more money, and what happened is that with changes in the law, for instance, Lewis Powell made the first decision at the Supreme Court, wrote the majority opinion on allowing corporations to have a role in giving money for ballot initiatives. This was a state legal case where the state of Massachusetts had tried to keep companies from giving money in a bank-related initiative. And that was kind of the beginning of the personhood of corporations that has led to so much trouble today. So this has had an enormous effect on our political system and on our food system. And I like to pick on both political parties because really there's no disagreement about lax antitrust enforcement. This is something that both major political parties agree upon, and what Ronald Reagan started, Bill Clinton really finished. And you can look at a number of industries. Let's take the media, because I think if you're looking at food or almost any issue that we talk about today, the media should play a major role in educating people, giving people different views and letting people make having educated opinions. When Bill Clinton came into office, there were 50 large media organizations, media companies, and the consolidation had already begun. When he left office, there were 5 large media companies. Let's look at the meat industry, because the major changes in the meat industry really began under the Clinton administration, with the meat packers beginning to consolidate. The trade policies that have so threatened food safety, threatened farmers' ability to make a living, created factory farms, the profitability of factory farms. All of this is related to the trade agenda that President Clinton promoted. And he was one of the biggest cheerleaders, of course, for joining the North America Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, and the World Trade Organization as well. And what those trade agreements did was basically make it possible for companies, and we're talking about food, so food companies to produce food where it's cheapest for the multinational companies to either produce animals or to grow a lot of fruits and vegetables. And today, 50% of fruit comes from overseas, and 20 to 30% of vegetables, and more every year. So when the U.S. became a party to the WTO and NAFTA, there was a lot of pressure to get rid of the last vestiges of those New Deal programs, the last programs that were still around. The grain reserve was eliminated, even though it had made money and stabilized grain prices for decades. Millions of acres of marginal land were put back into production. The USDA's role in supply management was completely eliminated. It had already been weakened, but it was eliminated. And this piece of legislation that did this was called Freedom to Farm. That's always dangerous, right, when freedom is attached to a piece of federal legislation. Well, very soon, farmers were calling it Freedom to Fail, because what happened? Well, within the first 2 years, the price of corn had dropped by 50%, the price of soy had dropped by 40%. And that had a very dramatic effect on farmers, obviously, who couldn't make a living, but it was also what the food processors and grocery industry had been lobbying for. And we have to remember how those policies, those trade policies, actually got written. And one of the companies that was really instrumental was Cargill, the giant grain trader, meat processor, all-around food company. And they recognized that there had been a lot of disagreement amongst different food companies, and to get the trade deal that they wanted and to get rid of U.S. farm programs, they had to bring food companies together to advocate for the same policies. So they put together a coalition of 100 food-related companies and facilitated it. They had their debates because obviously different companies have different economic interests, even though they have a lot of common interests. So they hammered out a program, and that's the program that became the agreement on agriculture under the WTO. And Cargill actually wrote those farm policies, and they were mirrored then in the Freedom to Farm legislation, which is why the cost of commodities dropped so dramatically, because who benefits from really low-cost commodities? Well, grain traders, food processors, and eventually the grocery industry, and certainly the meat industry, the soda industry. So, we often hear about farmers being greedy and behind the food subsidy or the commodity subsidies that were instituted basically because farmers were going out of business. And we have to remember that today, a mid-sized farmer, and that's having sales between $100,000 and $250,000, makes about $19.3 thousand, half of that from the subsidy programs, which will be eliminated probably this time around if we ever get the Farm Bill actually passed. So it hasn't really been farmers. It's been very large consolidated farms have had some benefits. But the biggest beneficiaries really are those companies that lobbied for these policies. So let's look at how it affected them. Well, every year that corn and soy prices were low, which was the first several years after the WTO, the soda industry saves about $100 million. The meat industry, though, was completely restructured. And those of you from North Carolina probably can remember when the hog industry really began to take over. And it was a result, number one, of the meat packers consolidating and then the cheap feed that became available for hogs. So in 1992, 30% of hogs were raised in factory farms. In 2004, after the cheap feed became available, 80% of hogs. And in 2007, the last time that the USDA did their statistics, 95% of hogs were raised on factory farms. The chicken industry, always very consolidated, and the chicken industry is moving into North Carolina. The chicken industry really relies on, well, the chicken contract growers say it themselves, serfdom. An average contract grower makes between $12,000 and $15,000, and those companies, Tyson, Purdue, they get all of the benefits. They own the genetics, they own the chicks, they own the feed that has antibiotics and arsenic in sometimes. We did win have a big win this past week in that we got 3 arsenic drugs out of chicken feed. We have been hammering the FDA on this. But arsenic has traditionally been used in chicken feed, and they come and they get the chickens after 35 or 40 days, take them to their slaughter facilities, and they have lobbied to reduce the inspection of chicken meat. So today, 175 birds per minute can be slaughtered, and then they're dipped in, chlorine baths, trisodium phosphate baths, and that's to eliminate the bacteria, even though you're probably still eating fecal matter. And then it's sold under the Tyson or Purdue brand name. So, that's what the cheap feed and the consolidation has allowed. It's allowed abuse of the people who are doing the work, the animals, and ultimately the consumer. And so, we have today 20 large food processing companies that really control about 60+% of the brands in the grocery store. So the top 5 are PepsiCo, Nestle, Kraft, Tyson and the giant Brazilian meat company JBS that owns brands like Swift. JBS is the largest meat company in the world. Tyson and JBS flip places depending on who has recently bought a meat company somewhere else in the world. And these 20 companies really benefit from farmers not making a living and from consumers not having safe food. But even though these companies have tremendous influence on our food system, you know, these are the companies that have been able to use fat, sugar, and salt to basically addict people to junk food. They've figured out that children at the age of 3 have brand recognition, and that they are vying, the junk food companies, the processed food companies are vying for customers, and they know that if you start at a very young age preferring a brand, you know, let's say Pepsi or Coke, that you will probably have that brand loyalty throughout your life. And they also know that children are very important in determining what families eat. So they target children with advertising, and advertising is unregulated in this country because of the political influence of these companies. So that's just one of the public policies that they've had tremendous influence over. But even these very powerful food processing companies aren't on top of the power heap in the food industry. That would be the grocery industry. Today we have 4 grocery chains that control overall about 50% of grocery sales, and in many, many markets in the country, especially rural and suburban markets, 70 to 90%. And that would be Walmart, the Kroger brands, Target, and Costco. And Walmart really devised the system of figuring out how to suck all of the profit from the farm field up into their coffers. So today, 1 out of 3 grocery dollars is spent at a Walmart store, and the Walmart heirs have as much wealth as the bottom 40% of Americans. And you know, I think to me that's a metaphor for what's wrong with our food system and what's wrong with our democracy. Now, the way that Walmart is affecting food is through their need for high volumes at cheap prices. So figure that Walmart buys 1 billion pounds of beef every year. They don't want to deal with even 10 suppliers. They want to deal with a few suppliers. And you know, today we have 4 beef packers that control 80% of beef sales in this country. So Walmart does this through their control of the market. Contracts with Walmart are non-negotiable. If you're a supplier, even a giant supplier like PepsiCo, the biggest food company in the country, if you call junk food, snack food, food, Walmart is a really big piece of their business. So they listen to Walmart around packaging, around reducing the ingredients. Walmart can have a lot of influence. They're always looking at ways to cheapen products because they want lower, high volume prices every year. None of this is about quality. This is about how to produce these items at the cheapest way possible and to give Walmart a break. So contracts are non-negotiable. The big suppliers have to use the data systems that Walmart requires, the logistics systems. They have to use the packaging, even the way the products are unloaded into the store. It's all laid out by Walmart. And therefore, the rest of the grocery industry and the big box stores are copying this not just for groceries, but for all items. You know, whether you go to Lowe's or Home Depot, they're using this same model that Walmart has devised. And every year they want a cheaper price. So the idea that Walmart is somehow going to re-regionalize the food system or really change the food system, I mean, they're really one of the pressure points that is causing even organics, because so many of the 20 large food processors, 14 of them own the largest organic brands. So there's a lot of pressure on the organic standard because, for these big companies, it's basically about niche marketing. And then if we're talking about who's really in charge of the food system, if we want to go above Walmart, it's really the same for every industry. It's the financial services industry, because all of the pressure today, of course, is on having high stock prices and high quarterly profits, and there's no view on how to have sustainability in businesses. It's not just lack of sustainability in the environment. So I didn't really write Foodopoly to make everybody frown and to be a bummer. I really wrote Foodopoly as a call to action. A call to action to saving our democracy and to talking about some of the major systemic issues that have brought us to where we are today. To talking about restoring antitrust, because we have an economic system, right, that we all learned in school. It's supposed to be based on competition. Well, we don't have competition. All public policy is directed at allowing and driving consolidation. So, I think that there are a lot of exciting things happening with the local food movement, and you have a lot of those exciting things happening here in Asheville. And there are places in the country where some farmers can make direct sales and where there can be an impact on the local economy and where people are really enjoying the benefits. But that is only in, a narrow number of places, the West Coast, the Northeast, places like Asheville, and major metropolitan areas, and a lot of other mid-sized cities. Only 1/3 of farms, though, are really near a large metropolitan area. So I think that one of the major values of the local food movement, beyond helping the farmers and consumers who enjoy the benefits, is creating the kind of community that can be a catalyst for the political change that we need to make, right? Because when you have a strong community, when you have people communicating who are educated about the issues, they can begin to play a role. And that political activism probably has to start in communities. And then it has to spread to state legislatures. I mean, we have a pretty good example of what happens when you have state legislatures overtaken by individuals who are not representative of most Americans. I don't think most Americans want to starve people and destroy the nutrition programs or a lot of other things that are happening at the state and federal level. But when there isn't a vigorous organizing for state legislative races, you end up with people who aren't representative, and every 10 years, what happens? They decide how to draw the districts and who goes to Congress. And that's why we have basically a handful of lunatics in Congress today who won't let us even have a federal budget. And I don't think that is reflective of what most Americans want. So I really wrote Foodopoly to make the case for old-fashioned grassroots organizing, getting people involved, getting involved in the local food movement, but taking it another step. Because, I've been traveling since January with this book, and everywhere I go, I think I've been to 30 states, number of Midwestern and Southern states. People are mad, and they want action. They want to organize, and I think the time is now that we really have to do the organizing, and we can do it when we have the long view, when we look at how long it actually takes to achieve these things. And I always take a lot of hope from what happened in the 1930s. I mean, the 8-hour workday, the end to child labor in factories, what happened in the 50s with the civil rights movements. These are long-term battles. So we need to break these issues down, get people involved, and then take it to the next level. And I think we can do it. I know you can do it here in Asheville, where you have a fantastic community. So I think I will end it there and take comments and questions.
We do have time for questions, so I know you all have some.
Happy for comments, too.
We'll call on you. There you go.
Yeah,
Okay.
So my question is, so I grew up in rural Illinois. My dad's an agronomist for Pioneer Hybrid, and now I work at Dickinson College as a sustainability coordinator. And so I see a lot of young people my age, when they're interested in agriculture in these rural areas, they're really being pushed to leave the farms, the family farms, and agribusiness. And if they're coming into the sort of liberal arts, middle or upper middle class or upper class folks who are doing this sort of enchanted return to the land to do farming, the local foods movement. I think you're both really pointing towards that. Neither of these is going to be the answer, that we need to sort of looking at systemic problems. So how do we talk to young people like myself? How do I talk to other young people? And for those who are doing the sort of enchanted back to the land, it's more than enchanted, but the back to the land approach, small farms, local foods, and how to talk to folks in rural communities that agribusiness isn't the answer, that's not the way out.
I look at Illinois, and I was pretty impressed this year that Illinois had legislation introduced for labeling genetically engineered food. And we have an office. Food and Water Watch has 17 offices, and one of our offices is in Illinois. And we saw a lot of rural young people who are university students, granted, coming and testifying on that legislation, who probably percentage-wise a small group of people, but who are really interested in agriculture, are concerned about the role of the biotech industry, of Monsanto, and got involved in the politics. And I think that is part of what we need to get young people involved in, not just growing food, because we know if you are a farmer in Illinois, and if you're taking over your family farm, out, unless you're near Chicago, it's going to be very difficult to make a living. The equipment on the farm is going to probably be for planting and harvesting row crops like corn and soy. It's going to be impossible to make the investment, even if you inherit that farm free and clear, to switch to growing something else. So that's why I think that to really make it feasible for young people to go into farming, we have to make these bigger changes in farm policy. We have to make it possible for young farmers to get loans, very low interest loans, so that they can actually access land and equipment. And that has to be done via the Farm Bill. So I guess for me, I'm most concerned in those rural communities about how do we educate those young people who are going to universities where Monsanto is paying for a lot of the education, and a lot of other companies too, and they are not even hearing a fair assessment of the food system. And I think that's a real challenge for all of us, and that in part it has to be other young people, it has to be through social media, it has to be through activism on college campuses, which, most college campuses that I go to have even in southern states like Alabama, where people say, oh, you went to Alabama? Well, Alabama has a really pretty vibrant student community on some campuses, and we shouldn't be prejudiced about where the change comes from. So I don't have an easy answer. I don't think there is an easy answer, but I think part of it is getting these people involved in their communities and in politics.
And we have a campaign here in North Carolina.
Yeah, we do have a campaign in North Carolina for young people, and at the end I'm going to ask Renee, who is in our Durham office, to talk about it. So don't let me forget. But let's take some of these comments. I don't know who had their hand up. So first, I'm going to start over here and then move this way, okay? So. Question?
Yes, two.
Okay.
I wonder if you have commented on Monsanto's practices of selling worldwide genetically manufactured seeds which destroy farms and destroy farmer lives, and farmers commit suicides. And they did here also of monopolizing the seeds of seeds.
And it's linked to the fertilizer.
No, actually corn seeds.
Yeah, I can speak to that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And second question about FDA and USDA laying so many regulations on organic farmers. I watched one documentary where USDA came in to a farm and took away all their goats and went and slaughtered them and then gave some money to the farmer.
I didn't talk a lot about the biotech industry because I know that people know a lot about what Monsanto and the biotech industry are doing, but you know, obviously they have had a enormously horrible impact around the world on peasant farmers in places like India, where they sold cotton seeds that were very expensive and that took expensive chemicals, the matched glyphosate chemicals, and then they weren't able to make a living, and there have been literally millions of Indian farmers have committed suicide about this. And you know, we are hearing all of this nonsense about how we need GMOs to feed the world, which is just a, you know, it's a PR stunt. What we really need to do to feed people is to, number one, keep the 2 billion peasant farmers who feed themselves on the land rather than driving them into the dollar economy, as we did with NAFTA and other trade agreements and policies. So, you know, I think the biotech industry is having a very, just a really awful effect worldwide. And you know how they buy public policy here. Food and Water Watch did a 10-year study on the biotech industry's influence on federal regulation. We found over a 10-year period they spent $572 million on campaign contributions and lobbying. They hired 13 former members of Congress and 300 former staffers for Congress and for the White House. And they have about 100 lobby shops in Washington. So if you wonder why they write regulations, that's why. And really it's the same with the USDA and FDA. These are political appointees who make these decisions, and it's a lot harder to deal with food safety issues in the giant meatpacking houses or in the dairy industry where there's going to be political blowback on them. So they pick on small farmers that have raw milk or, you know, are doing some kind of processing. It's all, it's basically the political influence on these agencies, which is why the politics are important. Okay, here and then here and then there.
Is there any move to increase the transparency in the universities for corporations funding chairs that then only push in one direction, and not just in agriculture, but BB&T Bank funds Ayn Rand only classes in certain colleges and universities? They'll fund the chairs, but they have to go for Ayn Rand only.
We report at Food and Water Watch on this issue on agriculture. It was almost impossible to get the numbers on how much companies are actually contributing. We did in a number of universities. I don't remember the name of that report. Do you, Renee? It's on our website, but we looked at, you know, the Monsanto chair, the enormous amount of money that's going into every aspect of agricultural education, and it's true in every industry. And no, there's no move for transparency that I know of. And I think it's one of our major promises. It's one of the reasons I talk about the Powell memo, because they talked about influencing education, and that's happening. Okay, here and then back there. Yes.
Okay. Dr. Deborah Davis in Secret War on Cancer talked about how in 1938 we knew that benzene was carcinogenic. And we've decided that that's okay. We can have benzene because it makes business work. Cost-benefit analysis makes business work. Okay. Along comes the Food Safety and Modernization Act, and they decide that we can't take any chance whatsoever on small farmers making people sick. Even though, if you look at statistics, the number of small farmers that make people sick is way smaller probably than the number of people who die from benzene. But small farmers are not allowed to make anybody sick. And consumer groups, including, I think, in the beginning anyways, Food and Water Watch went along with food safety legislation, which was putting this burden on small farmers. Now, you did eventually, at Food and Water Watch, come in support of the Tester Amendment.
Well, we helped push the Tester Amendment. We didn't, I mean, we believe that it's very important to have strong food safety regulations directed at large companies, and that's what we supported with the Food Modernization Act. Now, the legislation got, like all federal legislation, messed with, and we actually worked with a coalition of groups to get the Tester Amendment that exempts small farmers from the act. Now, the fact that USDA and FDA are picking on small farmers and small meat processors, that's been going on long before the act. The act isn't even being enforced. And so, you know, I think there's a libertarian strain in the good food movement that believes that there shouldn't be any food safety regulation. And since most people get their food from large corporations, we believe that there needs to be inspection. People are going to die. We do not think that small farmers should be picked on and have never supported that. There was also a lot of misinformation that went around the internet that on that legislation that was actually paid for by the herbal medicine industry that doesn't want to be regulated. And so there were a lot of rumors and things that were real problematic. But I will agree that the major consumer groups went along with privatization of meat inspection, which we have been fighting since we were part of Ralph Nader's Public Citizen, and that there needs to be a real close relationship with farmers, which is why we take a lot of our cues on farming from the National Family Farm Coalition that is comprised of small farm groups.
I guess.
This gentleman and then you, because you just put your hand up. So
there's the old saying, you know, think globally, act locally. Are there any models in other industrialized countries that produce a lot of food that the U.S. could learn from? Japan, EU, China, Brazil. I mean, these countries, are they imitating us, or do they have models that we might be able to follow?
Well, it's interesting. China has some stronger additive laws than the U.S. and on genetic engineering. Japan has some good laws in some areas. The EU, some of the northern European countries. Now, unfortunately, Europe, and we've always looked at Europe as a countervailing force to U.S. policy on a lot of things, but certainly ag and food policy. There is a new trade agreement that is being debated, that transatlantic free trade agreement that is designed to attack Europe's precautionary principle that we need to be safe rather than sorry. And there's been a lot of corporate influence recently in the EU, especially since Eastern Europe joined the EU, that has begun to weaken EU policies. But still, countries like Switzerland, for instance, have excellent labeling. They support small farms. You know, much different, much smaller country than the United States. But, you know, I think we know what to do. We just don't have the political will to do it in this country, right? It's about political will more than knowing what we want to do. Okay, I think there was a gentleman here who had his hand up.
I'm intrigued by your response to Pat's question, because I was one of the organizers of the coalition that you joined, okay? And there's no question that there were individual groups within the herbal industry that didn't know their butt from third base, right? But misinformation primarily came from the group that you were a part of, the Make Our Food Safe group, led by the Center for Science and the Public Interest, put out a number of things that were so stunningly misleading, it was mind-boggling.
Let me just clarify, and I doubt if everybody's interested in this. The Safe Food group that you mentioned, we do go to those meetings as a watchdog, and we put out statements usually where we disagree, where there are positions put forth by Center for Science and the Public Interest, for instance, has gone along with a lot of the industrialization issues like privatizing meat inspection. And, you know, we are Washington, we do have an office in Washington, we do go to those committee meetings, we sometimes sign on, we often are a dissenting voice. So, you know, I just can't apologize for being for strong food safety. We don't want food safety regs that hurt small farmers. And, you know, we worked very hard from all of our state offices to get that tester amendment passed, along with a lot of other groups. So, you know, I'm not sure what else to say about that.
My follow-up question is that if that be true, okay, then your organization, May of 2009, I believe it was, published a very explicit paper on the impact of the HACCP rules on meat and how it drove small meat producers out of business.
Absolutely. We criticized it.
Both the 2009 Food Safety Enhancement Act and the Food Safety Modernization Act both had exactly that model of food safety regulation.
That model is law. That law did not come to pass as part of the Federal Modernization Food Safety Act.
Not the HACCP rule. I'm saying the same exact model of HACCP is the Hazard Analysis Risk-Based Preventive Control, except they say it's even stronger.
I mean, go to our website. Nobody has criticized HACCP more than we have. We don't always like every piece of federal legislation, every single piece of it. We decided that that bill was better than nothing because it actually really targeted a lot of the problems in the large corporatized fruit and vegetable farmers. People are getting sick and dying. So, I really can't apologize for wanting food safety regulation. And, you know, we try to advocate not to have it hurt small farmers, and have always done so.
So that's enough. We need to let other people have
Okay, I think there were other hands. Yes.
First of all, thank you so much for your research and your book and your efforts. There's a lot of us that really appreciate it a lot. I've got a quick, easy question. Why arsenic in chicken feed?
You know, it makes the meat pretty and pink, and it increases production. They don't know why it increases production, but it's been used in the chicken industry for literally decades. We got involved in it because we do a lot of work in Maryland on one of the major poultry producing states, and we ran a 3-year state legislative campaign there to get arsenic out of chicken feed in that state, which we eventually won. It was a brutal battle. And so I have been working to get the FDA to, the FDA had the power. They could have done this years ago. So finally last week, they announced that they were going to take 3 of the arsenic drugs off the market for chicken feed. You know, there are a lot of.
We can get.
Well, you know, most people don't even know that that arsenic and antibiotics are in chicken feed. So.
One more question.
One more question. Okay. Yes.
What is the hardest part of writing the book? What is the most difficult thing for you as an author?
Well, I think it was.
What's the question?
What's the hardest thing about writing this book? You know, I think it's a frustration about how much we've lost without really knowing that we lost it as the decades moved along. How many of these things happen behind closed doors, and how disillusioned people have become and how they don't want to get involved in politics anymore. I mean, everywhere I go, I have people say, I don't do politics. Well, everything about your life is politics, right? Everything you're exposed to, how much you pay. And so I think it's figuring out how we can really mobilize people and do what's best for our society and for future generations, especially as we face climate change and a lot of really critical issues in the future.
Didn't you say you were going to get your college?
Yes, I am. Renee.
Yeah, the
She's gonna
petition.
announce it.
Yeah, no, I was just gonna tell people, first of all, let's get Wenonah.
Now we move on to the signing portion of tonight's presentation. I'm going to ask everyone who already has a book to form a line right at this speaker that I'm pointing at. If you haven't bought a book yet, we've got plenty for sale at the sales counter. And before you get up to do that, Wenonah's colleague Renee is going to raise your hand real big. Renee has a petition and she's going to say a few words about it.
Yeah, so here in North Carolina, we're working to get genetically engineered food labeled as a first step to raise awareness about the genetically engineered food issue and all of our food politics. And so over the summer, we collected over 10,000 petitions. We met with Senator Hagan's office in 2 locations, and she said she's movable on this issue to sponsor national legislation, working with Representative Carney out of Charlotte to get state legislation. And so if you'd like to sign the petition and join the movement, that would be great. And I'll be back here, and we have some information over here about Food and Water Watch if you're interested. And that's it. Thank y'all for your time.